Once again, US President Donald Trump has shaken the world and set a motion that will change global trade completely. Before now, Trump's tariffs have been targeted toward countries like China and Canada. But now he has decided to go all out, practically imposing tariffs on the world. And African countries are not exempted. In fact, 51 African countries have been targeted by Trump's tariffs, except Burkina Faso and Somalia. The question is, will this affect the African economy? And if it does, what can Africans do to mitigate the effect? Let's find out. On Wednesday, April 2nd, 2025, declared Liberation Day by President Trump, Trump unveiled his magnificent tariff plan that threw the global market into chaos. The president announced his grand plan to impose tariffs on several countries around the world. Speaking at the event, Trump stated that the US had been taken advantage of by cheaters and had been pillaged by foreigners. Our taxpayers have been ripped off for more than 50 years, but it is not going to happen anymore, he said. This is why Trump decided to unveil a list of 100 countries that have been hit by the US tariffs. The US president has argued that slapping these nations with tariffs would bring industry and jobs back to the United States by fighting against what he claims are unfair duties imposed by others on US goods. His administration has slapped a 10% baseline tariff on imports from every country, even those that impose lower tariffs on US products. For countries that the administration accuses of actively blocking US goods, the penalties go even further with steeper retaliatory tariffs. Mostly, countries hit with the highest tariffs are those with whom the US has the largest trade deficits. We will charge them approximately half of what they are and have been charging us, so the tariffs will not be reciprocal, Trump said on Wednesday afternoon. I could have done that, I guess, but it would have been tough for a lot of countries, and we didn't want to do that. Now, among the list of roughly 100 countries, the tariffs hit a total of about 51 African countries. This includes Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, and Lesotho. Out of the 51 African countries, 27 of them were slapped with only the 10% baseline universal tariffs on all US imports. The rest of the countries were hit with additional tariffs based on the level of trade surplus with the US. Interestingly, Lesotho, the country Trump said last month that no one knows about, was hit with a staggering 50% tariff. It has the second highest figure besides China, which was hit with a 54% tariff. The reason for this is that the US has a big trade deficit with Lesotho, which sells textiles including jeans and diamonds to America. In 2024 alone, while the US exported just $2.8 million worth of goods to Lesotho, it imported $237.3 million from the country mostly made up of diamonds and textiles. Taking advantage of the African Growth and Opportunity Act, Lesotho has been successful in selling textiles to the US in recent years. Lesotho's garment factories have made jeans for major American brands such as Levi's and Wrangler in recent years. Interestingly, the US is Lesotho's second biggest trading partner after South Africa, and clothes make up nearly 3/4 of what Lesotho exports to the US. The value of that US trade amounts to more than 10% of its total annual national income. The extra costs that the tariffs will incur for American buyers could reduce demand and therefore have a big impact on Lesotho's economy. Besides Lesotho, Africa's largest economies, South Africa and Nigeria, were among those on Trump's reciprocal tariffs list. This means countries the president said treat us badly. These include countries that impose high tariffs on US goods or have introduced other barriers to US trade, according to Washington. Both countries were hit with a 30% and 14% tariff respectively. For South Africa, Trump stated that for decades, South Africa has imposed animal health restrictions that are not scientifically justified on US pork products, permitting a very limited list of US pork exports to enter South Africa. He also noted that South Africa also heavily restricts US poultry exports through high tariffs, anti-dumping duties, and unjustified animal health restrictions. These barriers have contributed to a 78% decline in US poultry exports to South Africa, from $89 million in 2019 to $19 million 2024. For these and other reasons, including the current tension between South Africa and the US, South Africa received a whopping 30% tariff. While South Africa's biggest export to the US, platinum may be exempted from the tariffs, its second biggest export, cars, will be hit hard. Specifically, South Africa had already been affected by a separate 25% tariff on all foreign-made cars that went into force this week. According to the country's Ministry of Trade, Industry and Competition, South Africa exports vehicles and parts worth $2 billion to the U.S. under the AGOA framework. As for Africa's most populous country, Nigeria, Trump slapped a significant 14% tariff, which experts say presents a significant risk to the $10 billion annual exports to the United States. Like South Africa and Lesotho, Nigeria has exported an estimated $277 billion worth of goods, majorly oil, to the United States under the AGOA. According to recent data, Nigeria's exports to the United States currently average between $10 billion and $12 billion annually. However, according to experts, the tariffs have the potential of disrupting key sectors such as oil export and agricultural trade. This would in turn raise the price of goods and services for consumers, weaken standard of living, and slow down manufacturing activities. In particular, Nigeria's oil exports, which constitute almost all of Nigeria's exports to the U.S., would see a major decline. Now, given the tariffs, experts have said that the tariffs might potentially impact the African Growth and Opportunity Act. The AGOA is a U.S. legislation that was established in 2000 and allows eligible African countries to send some goods to the U.S. without having tariffs slapped on them. It was signed into law by President Bill Clinton and was intended to help African countries grow their economies and create jobs. However, these tariffs will effectively override AGOA privileges and negatively impact African economies that are reliant on U.S. trade. Currently, 32 African countries are eligible for the program. The AGOA, which expires in September, grants duty-free access to more than 1,800 products from eligible sub-Saharan African countries and has formed the backbone of U.S.-Africa trade policy for 25 years. It was renewed for 10 years in 2015. Chocolate and basket weaving materials from Mauritius, musical instruments from Mali, and nuts from Mozambique are among the products that have reached U.S. buyers through AGOA. But beyond potentially affecting the AGOA, experts have emphasized that the new tariffs would have negative impacts on African manufacturers and lead to increased living costs, loss of jobs, and generally increase the standard of living. Speaking on this issue, Nwanzi of SBM Intelligence noted that increased export costs would reduce competitiveness, potentially decreasing revenue and destabilizing economies. Sectors such as the agricultural and mineral extraction businesses are likely to be particularly vulnerable, he added, as most African manufacturers sell raw goods, not finished products, to the U.S. Generally, African countries like South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya, which have long-standing trade relations with the U.S., will be hit the most. Nigeria is still in the throes of a cost-of-living crisis that has led to high levels of hunger and poverty. South Africa, meanwhile, already records some of the highest levels of unemployment in the world, with an estimated 6 out of 10 people out of a job. Thus, the tariffs might even worsen everything. Speaking to the South African publication IOL before Trump's announcement, Casey Sprake, an economist at South African investment firm Anchor Capital, said a 25% scenario could cut the country's economic growth by between 0.2 and 0.3 percentage points. Now, here is a very important question. How have African leaders responded to Trump's tariffs? Well, currently only a few African countries have made public statements regarding the tariffs. South Africa's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, was the first to respond to the tariffs. In a statement on Thursday, President Cyril Ramaphosa's office called the tariffs on the country punitive and added that they would serve as a barrier to trade and shared prosperity. The government also pledged to seek redress with Washington. The tariffs affirm the urgency to negotiate a new bilateral and mutually beneficial trade agreement with the U.S. as an essential step to secure long-term trade certainty, the statement read. From this statement, we can deduce that the South African government is not keen on engaging in a trade war with the U.S. by imposing retaliatory tariffs. Instead, the government intends to follow a path of diplomacy and negotiate. Similarly, Lesotho's trade minister, Mokethi Shalili, said his government would send a delegation to Washington to argue against the new trade measure. "My biggest concern was the immediate closure of factories and job losses," he said following Trump's announcement. However, unlike African countries, other European countries hit by the tariffs have indicated that they would retaliate. The Chinese ministry, for instance, stated that China firmly opposes this and will take countermeasures to safeguard its own rights and interests. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has also noted that the EU is preparing further countermeasures. "We are already finalizing the first package of countermeasures in response to tariffs on steel," she said, referring to Trump's 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum that went into effect last month. Japan has also said it was leaving all options open to respond to the extremely regrettable duties. However, experts agree that only a few big nations can afford to retaliate. Places like Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines have been hit with higher tariffs, but the size of their economy, their dependence on external trade, and the importance of the US as a source of final demand will really constrain their ability to adopt a hawkish attitude here. This same reason is why African countries like South Africa and Lesotho have chosen to negotiate rather than retaliate. And this is exactly what Trump wants. According to analyst Van Heerden, Trump's tactic is deliberately to distort. The Trump strategy, including this latest stunt of tariffs, is to be a serious disruptor who does things in the extreme in order to force people to come to the negotiating table. And once you are at the negotiating table, that's when the Trump administration will say what it truly wants. If you want a favorable trade agreement with the US, you will have to compromise on things that are not necessarily trade-related, he said. In the case of South Africa, this could possibly mean the case that we brought to the International Court of Justice against Israel for genocide. In simple terms, if any African country wants a favorable trade agreement with the US, it would have to submit to the demands of the US in other areas. It could be in terms of access to resources, or in the case of South Africa, dropping the ICJ case against Israel. This is the typical imperialist approach. The question is, should African countries submit their sovereignty simply because they want access to the US market? Isn't there another alternative? Well, the fact is that there are multiple alternatives. You see, the US does not trade much with Africa. Actually, Africa's biggest trade is with China currently. In 2024, the US only imported $39 billion worth of goods from Africa, which is roughly what it imports from Mexico or Canada in just over a month. The US imports more in 24 hours from either of them than it imports in a year from about 40 African countries. The biggest exceptions are South Africa and to some extent Nigeria, which account for over half of everything the US imports from the continent. So, while South Africa, Lesotho, and Nigeria might be hit the hardest, the fact is that Trump's tariffs might have just a little impact on African countries. And even if it does have a significant impact, African countries now have alternatives. Countries like China and Russia are very much happy to trade with Africa. Already for nearly 20 years, China has overtaken the US as Africa's top trading partner and represents one of the continent's largest bilateral lenders. China imports primary goods such as crude oil, iron ore, copper, and is increasingly focusing on agricultural produce as well. On the other hand, the country exports finished products such as electronics back to the continent. Finally, Africa has historically been an exporter of raw materials rather than finished goods. However, with reduced Western trade dominance, African countries have the chance to scale up local production. Nations like Nigeria, Egypt, and South Africa are investing in textiles, pharmaceuticals, and automotive industries, allowing them to become suppliers of finished goods to their neighbors instead of depending on imports from the US or Europe. Now, if this happens, the reliance on the US dollar for trade settlements could decline. More countries could adopt regional trade settlement systems using local currencies, strengthening African financial independence. So instead of seeing the US tariffs as a challenge, African countries should see it as an opportunity to grow and a path to industrialization. Meanwhile, as Trump slaps African countries with tariffs, members of the AES Confederation are deepening ties with Russia. Few days ago, the foreign ministers of the Alliance of Sahel states, namely Burkina Faso's Karamoko Jean-Marie Traore, Niger's Bakari Yao Sangare, and Mali's Abdoulaye Diop, arrived at Russia's capital city Moscow on Thursday for the first session of the AES Russia consultations. Speaking at a joint press conference, the foreign ministers of Mali and Niger stated that this meeting reflects the shared commitment of the heads of state of the AES and the Russian Federation to expand their partnership and political dialogue at the confederal level and to place them at the heart of their diplomatic development and defense agenda in order to address the deep aspirations of the populations of the AES region. Russia has already signed defense agreements with the 3 AES countries and supplied arms and military training. Mercenaries from the Africa Corps, the rebranded Wagner Group, are also active in the region, supporting their fight against jihadist insurgents. The foreign ministers described the talks as an important step toward building strategic and pragmatic cooperation in areas of shared interest. In addition to defense, Russia is also working with the AES on energy and mining projects. A regional investment bank created by the alliance in March is expected to pursue financing and partnerships with Moscow as part of its development strategy. Moscow and the AES countries committed to enhancing efforts to combat terrorism and instability in the Sahel, according to a joint communique issued after the Russia-AES foreign ministers meeting. The parties strongly condemned acts of aggression by states that support terrorism, in particular, Ukraine's criminal collusion with armed terrorist groups operating in the Sahel, read the communique. The meeting between the AES and Russia reflects the decision of the AES to distance themselves from the West and deepen ties with non-Western countries. Hopefully, this budding relationship will bear fruits that will be beneficial to the AES Confederation. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel.